Good, Marlon. Thanks for being here with me. Can you start by telling us your name and what your position is?
Okay, I'm Marlon Weichart, a federal prosecutor in Brazil, and I'm working in the Office of the Federal Attorneys for Citizens' Rights. Now I'm acting as a deputy in this office.
And can you tell me a little bit about what your office does in Brazil?
Oh, it's not easy because it's very peculiar. We are an office within the Federal Prosecutor Service office, so in the Office of the Prosecutor General. And in Brazil, the public ministry, so the prosecution service, it's also a human rights office. So we have this double phase, I would say. And I've been committed to this part of the branch of the public ministry service. So we, in some way, when we compare, for example, with another Latin American countries, they have a special institution. It's called Defensoria del Pueblo. So it would be a kind of ombudsman office. In Brazil, this is mixed. This function was given by the Constitution to the public prosecution service.
And can you talk a little bit about what sorts of cases and what you're doing and how it relates to, or how you think about it as being related to mass atrocity prevention?
Great. Our office works with any kind of human rights subjects. Only that indigenous people's rights, we have a specific and more specialized office that works in parallel with us. But for all the other subjects concerning the human rights promotion and protection, we are in the function of articulating the work of like 100 prosecutors in Brazil, and also representing the institution abroad and before the federal government. So for example, I've been working harder with transitional justice issues and very committed with the idea of guarantee of non-recurrence. So what gives this connection with the preventing mass atrocities and preventing gross human rights violations. We work as well with public security in Brazil. Unfortunately, our country has one of the highest rates of violence or homicides in the world, and partly because the police force, the security force are also very lethal. So we are trying to, in some way, to intervene in this situation and create space for dialogue and trying to convince the governments and state levels especially to promote some institutional reforms to change this scenario. So I think that in human rights, even when you think that you are only working on protection, indeed what you are doing is promotion as well. So it's always refueling the idea of prevention of mass atrocities.
I know that one important thing that you've done is to speak up years ago now, is to speak up very publicly against the Amnesty Law in Brazil. Can you talk about what the Amnesty Law was, what it did, and why you took such a strong position against it?
Yeah, so Brazil had a dictatorship from 1964 up to 1985. It was one of the longest dictatorships in South America. Only Paraguay had a longer dictatorship. And the transition from the dictatorship to democracy in Brazil was entirely controlled by the military. It started indeed in 1979 when the government enacted an amnesty law. It was a different amnesty law of the other amnesty laws that were enacted in the continent, because it was a bilateral amnesty law. What does it mean? That it was an amnesty law that was amnestying these dissidents, the political dissidents, to the regime, because in 1979 the regime had already almost completely destroyed any form of resistance to dictatorships. And I think it's interesting to understand that in Brazil, the repression was conducted broadly using the legal system, the judiciary, the military judiciary. So a lot of people were convicted for crimes against the citizen, crimes in the framework of what we call the doctrine of national security. So it was a fight for the civil society, especially from the women that were in the leadership of the Amnesty movement, to release all these political dissidents that were arrested, thousands of them, and many thousands also in exile. So it was a social movement that was claiming for this amnesty. And then the government took this opportunity as well to create an amnesty for the perpetrators of human rights violence. So it's called a bilateral amnesty. This is unique in Brazil. I don't remember if any other country in the continent had the same structure, because basically Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, the repression was completely illegal. It was outside of the legal framework. So the Brazilian military, they were very formalist, and they created laws to repress the political dissidents. So this law was approved in 1979, and it was part of this process of controlling the transition to democracy. So when it was in 1999, I started working with Transitional Justice, basically based on the idea of the search and identification of remains of disappeared people. But in 2007, after Argentina was conducting trials against perpetrators, and the Inter-American Court on Human Rights had decided a case related to Chile, it's the Almonacid Arellano case, establishing that the Pinochet dictatorship had committed crimes against humanity. I went through this case and studying the grounds. I connected and I defended, I published in the first paper for my boss of the Prosecutor General, arguing that in Brazil also crimes against humanity were committed by the military, by the security force, and that we could not use the Amnesty Law to keep perpetrators, that keep the security force impunity. And also that state of limitation, that's another huge barrier in legal terms to conduct prosecutions and trials. It was also incompatible with the international law. So this was the first step that we were starting to promote justice in Brazil for these outrageous crimes.
And you would later go on to serve on the Amnesty Commission in Brazil. Can you talk about what the Amnesty Commission is or was, and what your role in it was?
Yeah, so the Amnesty Brazil has two main federal reparation programs, because we have some in the state level as well. So one program was conceived for the families of killed and disappeared persons, and there is another reparation program conceived for all the others victims of dictatorships. And there is a commission that has to look at the case, so any person that feels that was victim of dictatorship can request a compensation and presents before the Amnesty Commission its case, his or her case. Then for a while, I was a member of the Amnesty Commission that was in charge of reviewing and deciding if this case were could be accepted in the reparation program or not. So I was in this commission, I guess, like for 5 years as one of the commissioners. And then after, it was too hard to me, and as soon as the political conditions in the country were getting this more and more tough, I had to leave the commission because I had to concentrate my activities in the prosecution, in the Office of the Prosecutor for Citizens' Rights.
A lot of these processes you've been talking about that you've been involved in are relating to this broader field of transitional justice. What do you see as the preventive capacities of dealing with the past through these transitional justice mechanisms, like criminal prosecution, like amnesty commissions or truth commissions and things like this?
Yeah, I think that when we work with transitional justice, we need to always preserve and be committed with the idea that we are not working just in one point. Transitional justice must always have a holistic approach, so very, very broader view. For example, it was very interesting because in the Amnesty Commission, in the beginning, when it started working, I just came to the commission 10 years later. It was very, very narrow perspective that no, we are here just to decide if we have to pay compensations or not for these victims. And slowly it was changing with the idea that the education target is super important, that also the symbolic reparation. So the former president of the commission, in the time I was there, he created such kind of road shows. So the commission was going in many different cities, and not only to decide the case. The case was part of it because when we were having like public meetings of the commission and deciding publicly, discussing this case with the society around. So, but we used to choose to go to have this road show, if always when possible, in universities, in college, and in labor unions as well. So to communicate, to transmit to people the idea of the never again. So it happened, and how do we deal with this in the present, but looking for the future, looking at the future. I mean, so making this connection, and this is super important. So it's not because it's just a reparation program that you're gonna look to the past and to the victims. No, you have to look at the broad society. So I think this is a good example how you can, from sometimes a very narrow policy, create something bigger. And I think that in a more extensive dialogue with civil society and bringing always this idea of repetition. Because of course, people, when you start publicly about the dictatorship, people will make connection with the situation that are living in that moment. So, and what are the threats against the democracy? So you you create room for a more political discussion and a perception of the situation of the country and where we want to go, from where we are coming, but where we want to go.
There's a lot of debate in the field between scholars and practitioners about the preventive potential, or how prosecution is related to prevention. And some people say that we don't have any evidence that it's preventive. Some people say that it has a deterrent effect and therefore is preventive. And some people say it's more about this expressive quality of the law, right? Like the idea of the legal structures setting ideals or norms within a society. What, for you as a prosecutor, how do you think the prosecution of past crimes or current crimes is related to the prevention of future crimes?
This discussion concerning how criminal law can play a deterrence role, it's old in legal studies. So because it's the same discussion as a single homicide, a single crime should be punished just because it's a revenge, or it's the individual deterrence of the retribution, or it's a general deterrence. So it's conceived in the criminology. It's always discussed as well. There are some scholars that think, look, this is just an attempt to justification of criminal law, this idea of general deterrence. But I may say that basically it's almost a consensus that criminal law plays these roles as well. Of course, not only the individual retribution, the idea of individual deterrence as well in this single perspective, it's important. But a society that doesn't have a system that in some way sanction some behaviors that's completely against the social life cannot survive. Maybe it's not prison, it's not the best solution, but the sanction solution, the idea of having good sanctions and bad sanctions, it's part of the system. So I think that we are very, very comfortable with this in this sense. And in my opinion, when it comes to the most serious crimes, crimes against humanity, genocides, mass atrocities, so if even if we are adept of a minimum criminal law, this would be the first crimes that should be punished. Because especially here, it's very important that this general deterrence effect may be felt. I mean, I have no doubt, should say for you, for example, if we compare Brazil, where until today the accountability, criminal accountability for the perpetrators of dictatorship has been blocked by the Supreme Court, and we compare Argentina, that has a broad criminal accountability for perpetrators, that for instance, if one political leader has any attempt to be, no, I'm gonna try to be a dictator, to do something, he will feel free in Brazil, but in Argentina he will never consider this possibility because this general deterrence effect is in the air, and the society is claiming for it. For example, in Argentina, when the judiciary tried to change some rules concerning the state of limitation, it was a huge kind of popular mobilization against this change. Why? Because I think this is it's the main effect of all this process of criminal accountability that has been conducted by the Public Ministry of Argentina and the judiciary in Argentina. The same thing won't happen in Brazil. When we look at Brazil, where the security forces are still feeling free to kill and to summarily execute any suspect, like we have every week in the country, a new scandal happening, it's part of this impunity, this idea, look, the state in Brazil will always protect their officials, even when they commit the most serious crime. So if they commit especially a petty crime, so something not that serious as killing 100, but just killing one, and he's suspected of being a bandit. So okay, I'm super convinced, and I feel easy to defend that the criminal accountability for serious crime, or from the most serious crime, is one of the pillars to the guarantee of non-recurrence.
So right now, Brazil's going through a difficult moment relating to human rights with Bolsonaro's election and inauguration. What do you see as the role of the Federal Prosecutor's Office in the face of increased discourse and also legal measures and public policies being initiated that seem to be targeting certain identity groups?
So Brazil going through this new standard of a federal government that clearly it's not embarrassing sometimes in defend human rights violations. So the president during his campaign and before as a member of the parliament, he many times he defended some policies that would violate human rights. And he inaugurated his term, and indeed, in my opinion, my personal opinion, he already is stimulating and is investing in some measures that are against the human rights promotion and protection. But our role, I think, that doesn't change because of this. Indeed, our role is the same. Maybe I think that we have now much more work than we had before. And when I look at these first 100 days, this first 100 days of his mandate and our work during this time, it has been very intense. But it's very interesting how it's working, because I think that civil society, some way, it's really aware and recognizing and connecting these efforts between our official state level institution with the NGOs and social movements, and they are asking for some cooperations, and that's very interesting, because I think that we are in some way creating a stronger network of human rights defenders in the country, because the the threats the threats that comes from the government are so scary and sometimes it's so serious that it's provoking this reaction. So in my opinion, we haven't changed our way of work, but maybe we are working more intensively.
You gave a talk the other day about hate speech, mostly coming from Bolsonaro. I'm wondering, as a lawyer, what your view is in policing or restricting hate speech within a democratic society, and what kind of speech is it okay to restrict, and what kind of speech do we have to allow as a necessary but unfortunate byproduct of democracy?
Well, this discussion concerning hate speech is not easy. So when should hate speech be sanctioned by the legal system and by the judiciary? The limits sometimes are not clear, and my feeling that the main right is the idea that of freedom of expression. So the freedom of expression is one of the pillars of a democratic society. But on the other hand, it cannot be transformed in a way to promote prejudice and to promote, I would say, to promote the threatening of vulnerable groups and to go against also other basic values of a society. So it's tough to say abstractly what are the limits. We have to go, in my opinion, case by case. It's a very topic approach to see the case, what is involved in that situation. But for sure, for me, it's not compatible with our constitution, with the rule of law and the idea of democratic constitutions and the international law that someone could promote speeches connected with the idea that violating human rights is fine. So I think that we have already a very, very strong human rights standard, international human rights standard that provides these limits to such kind of approach. For example, it's not admissible, it's not protected by the freedom of speech, the idea of, for example, defending torture. Torture is the only crime that international law is absolutely forbidden. So there is no possibility in any case that a public official could defend that torture is legal and it's admissible. And mass atrocities, mass killings, for example, this is not acceptable. So I think it's far beyond what could be recognized as protected by the freedom of expression.
And then finally, you're here at the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton, and the goal of the Institute is to find a way of creating bridges between academics, practitioners, and policymakers. But obviously it's being housed within this academy, so what do you think academics could do better, or researchers could do better to help the work that you're doing that's maybe not being done now, or could improve the work that's being done?
I think that this connection between scholars, practitioners, and policymakers it's essential for all them, especially when we talk this connection between academics and practitioners. I'm going to give you my example. I'm a practitioner, but since I started working, for example, with my first work within the public prosecution service in the field of human rights was with the health rights. So the health to assess the public system, the right to assess the health public system in Brazil. that Brazil has a very protective standard. For example, every citizen always in any situation has the right to access the public system and to receive the most we call integral treatment, so that the whole treatment. So he cannot be denied even a very expensive and very critical treatment, for example. So it was my first work, my first job. And it was very interesting because the public system of health in Brazil was young. So I was working on this subject in 1996, for example, 1997, and the system was implemented in the 90s. So academia had nothing about it. It was too early. So I went to academia for my master, and I said, look, as I'm working, I'm feeling that I need grounds to understand. So I went to study in my master's the public health system. So it is the idea, if there was before maybe the academia dedicated to this, I could take advantage already of this connection and be in touch. In this case, I had to look for answers that I was demanding with my work. So this is only an example in the personal level that shows how important it is to connect practitioners with academia, and how academia should be opening its doors for practitioners. I may say for you that as a prosecutor, it's almost daily we came across some doubts, some issues that they are, even in very traditional questions like criminal law, that we have hundreds, thousands of books and papers published, that no, this is tricky, this is different, this is something new. It would be great if I could discuss this with someone that's not a practitioner, but that has a different perspective from the situation. So I think it's essential to build stronger institutions and to create institutions more committed to the outcomes of its task, of its function, to have these links between academia and business. It's not easy because it demands more time from the practitioner and from the scholars as well. Sometimes the language is different, the language that's used among scholars and among practitioners. So putting this closer, it's something essential. And that's something that I really appreciate in here with this program, this as a practitioner visiting Binghamton through the Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, IGMAP. This opportunity that the Institute is providing for me has been very useful. I hope that the same for the scholars that are taking part in it, because it's a new opportunity. It's not my first time, but it's a new opportunity, and especially for me that comes from another country, so with different legal system and different demands from the US, but to compare and to be in contact and be discussing the difference and the similarities between both systems, between both academias, and how it's a practitioner here. So I think it's essential to build stronger institutions, and especially institutions more committed with the promotion of democracy and the human rights that, as you last resources, is what we both, academia and public institutions committed to justice, are looking for.
Thank you, Marlon.
Thank you.